everybody. Welcome back to the KrakCast. Thanks for listening. We've got a very, very interesting show for you today. Great conversation coming up. First, a couple things. Let me apologize for my voice. I have been ill for almost a week now, I think. And on top of that, I made the very unwise decision to stay up late last night to watch the Fury Wilder fight. Actually, it was a good decision. It was a really good fight. Anybody else watch that, Dr. Mike? And you're not a fight guy.
Yeah,
Josh?
Sorry.
No? You should, a great fight.
I don't even know who those people are.
Great fight last night. And also a reminder to check out our website, KrakCast.pl. All of our back episodes are there, almost 360 episodes, including really a great conversation last week about the Polish city in the jungles of Brazil, Curitiba. Check that out if you haven't already. Okay, so Dr. Patrick Vaughan is a professor at the Jagiellonian University here in Krakow. Among other things, he is the author of the definitive biography of Zbigniew Pietrzykowski, the Polish-born national security advisor to American President Jimmy Carter. He's been on our show before to talk about life, the universe, and everything. And he's back. But this time, instead of diplomats and politics and books, we're talking about films and boxers. Get to the details in just a second. But before we do that, let's welcome Patrick back to the studio. Patrick, good to see you again. Welcome back.
Yeah, good to be with you guys again. Your studio looks nice, and looking forward to it.
Let's do it. Okay, so I'm going to paint the picture in broad strokes here, and then we're going to back up and take it from your own humble boxing origins. Now, you're working on a film. It's a work in progress right now, and it's about a Polish boxer named Zbigniew Pietrzykowski. Three-time Olympic medalist, five-time European champion, 11-time Polish champion, extremely impressive boxing resume. A little bit looked over by history, but we'll talk about that in just a second. But before we get into him and the Polish boxing scene, actually, I want to ask about your own experience in the ring, because I know from stalking you on Facebook, I know that you have your own history with the gloves. So let's start there. Tell us about that.
Well, there's a long story and a short story. If we have time, I remember...
Whatever you want.
I was originally from Seattle, and I grew up in California, but I ended up moving to West Virginia, Morgantown, West Virginia, when I was in my 20s. And somebody always told me, if you want to meet people, find a billiard table around town, because then they have to talk to you, especially if you hold the table and then you got 3 hours and you'll probably meet somebody. And by coincidence, I met a guy there, and he says, "Hey, buddy, you don't look like you're from around here." And I said, I'm not from around here. And he says, "Where are you from?" And I said, "California." And he says, "You shoot some good pool." And I said,
I like it already.
Yeah. And we ended up being partners. And we held the table for about, 4 or 5 hours. And, you get a bond. And I never even knew this guy. And I said, "What do you do?" And he goes, I work construction. I work at a construction firm. But my real job is training my son to be an Olympic boxer. And at the time, I thought, yeah, sure, And then the more I got to know him, and he says, "Yeah, my son's going to be in the Olympics. He's that good." And I said, how good is he? And he says, "Well, on the weekends, he goes up and trains at the maximum security prison up in Waynesburg in Pennsylvania. That's the biggest prison in Pennsylvania. It's where all the death row guys are, and they got a prison team up there." And I kind of listened to this story, and I said, what the hell? Who is this guy? He's crazy. And then about an hour later, I said, you ever worry about sending your boy up there to fight in a maximum security prison against the prison team? And he looked at me, and he had a cigar in his mouth, and he goes, "Buddy, you ought to be worried about the prisoners, because he's fought 40 fights up there and he hasn't lost one." and then we became kind of friends after that, because he's like one of these old school guys, lives up in the mountains, no electricity, one of these guys.
Patrick, I'm imagining the scene in my head. It sounds like a movie script. You should be writing this down and sending it to Hollywood.
Well, and then the next day, he says, I told him I played basketball, and that's what I did. I was a basketball player in high school and some college. I was a pretty good player. I could jump and move and that sort of thing. And we played the next day in Stansbury Gym, where Jerry West played. And we won a couple games, and we had complete hangovers.
Jerry West, by the way, icon from the NBA. Actually, the NBA logo is the profile of Jerry West, just a extra fact there.
So, and I'm just going to tell you the story as it was. And we won a couple games, and he goes, buddy, after he called me buddy, he still didn't know my name, I don't think. And he goes, man, you got some fast hands and you got some great footwork. I could teach you how to fight. I can't teach that. I can teach technique, but you got the natural skills. So if you want to fight, I can teach you. And I said, man, I don't know, because I was always a fight fan as a kid, but I never really did it. And then when about a year later, I blew out my knee playing basketball in that same gym, and to do the rehabilitation, I said, well, now is as good a time as ever. And he taught me how to fight. And he was a great trainer. He was old school. He had a gym in the basement somewhere, in the bottom of a restaurant. And he taught me how to fight old school Pittsburgh-style boxing. He says, I'm going to teach you how to fight like Billy Conn. And Billy Conn was the famous guy that fought Joe Louis. And he was from Pittsburgh. And that's how I got into it. And eventually he says, you're ready to fight. And he entered me into this West Virginia Tough Man contest, the toughest man in West Virginia, which is an all-comers boxing match.
It's kind of like open mic night at a comedy club, is it?
Yeah.
Anybody can step up.
I can't say it was the smartest thing I ever did. But he says, I said, it'll be like George Plimpton a little bit. I could write about it one day. And he says, George Plimpton, like hell, you're going to win this thing. And I said, man, I'm not going to win this thing. And he says, you could win this thing. So, and the problem was, and I mentioned this in the YouTube video, Michał Oleszek, who was a film critic in Poland, made this short clip about it. And the problem is I had contact lenses. And if you know anything about boxing, once you get hit, you're going to lose your lenses. And I'm minus 4.75. So you had to not get hit. You had to be like Sugar Ray Robinson to win that thing. And
I gotta say, Patrick, sounds like something that you should have thought about before you stepped in the ring. Huh?
Well, I told him about this because his vision was worse than mine. He says, just don't get hit. And I said,
great advice.
And that was true. When I sparred and I would get hit and I'd just have to fight blind. And that's what you do. When you fight, when you're a fighter, it's all about reflexes. You don't really use your eyes that much. It's surprising. But you can really get hit.
In a tough man contest, you have headgear and heavy gloves or what?
Yeah, you have headgear, you have a cup, obviously.
Right.
But it's, I'm not saying it's the most organized event ever. It's a bloodlust sport, but people like it. And, Butterbean was in this.
Sure.
Remember that guy?
Sure.
So that's how I got started in it. So maybe we can move on, but that's how I got started in it. And this guy, boxing, it's like no other sport, really. It's not like golf or basketball. When you go into the fight, you're going to really, win or lose, you're going to be hurting at the end of it. And somebody told me, in fact, this guy says, it's like taking your car out in the morning. You're going to get in a car accident. You're going to get, but you just don't know how bad it's going to be. And that's kind of how it was. But I'm glad I did it. He told me, buddy, he called me buddy. He goes, but I can tell you this, when I get through with you in 6 months, you'll never have to worry about losing a street fight in the rest of your life.
Nice.
You're in or you're out. So I said, I'm in. So that's how it started. So
your life goes on in other directions and you get into academia. But I think, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think that interest in boxing and sports generally, because I know you're a sports guy,
yeah.
it always stays there. It's always there. It's always, in the background somewhere. Yeah. So you get into academics. I mean, you as I mentioned earlier, you write the definitive biography of Zbigniew Pietrzykowski. You're involved in politics and academics. And of course, your life brings you here to Jagiellonian University. At what point did you kind of stumble across the story of Zbigniew Pietrzykowski, and at what point did you think, hey, there's something worth investigating here?
I was teaching a class years ago at West Virginia University, a summer school class, and I assigned the biography of Muhammad Ali written by David Remnick, and he's a great writer, and I recommend this book. It's a great book, but he had some throwaway line. He says, Cassius Clay won the 1960 Olympics in Rome, and he defeated a cafe owner from Poland. And I thought,
that's it.
Yeah, well, I thought there's got to be a more interesting story than that. And right away that got my attention. And I was already writing about Zbig Brzezinski. So I asked Zbigniew Pietrzykowski about that in the 1960 Olympics, and he says, "Yeah, he was a hero to West Poles in America, and he fought Clay in the gold medal round, and right away that's a story by itself."
Absolutely, you don't get to the gold medal fight against Cassius Clay, later Muhammad Ali, as a cafe owner. I mean, it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it was a throwaway line, and it was a little bit patronizing, I thought.
Absolutely.
So this is before the internet, really. At least before the modern internet. And there was no really way that I could get this story. You couldn't just Google it back then. And I said, one day I'd like to write that story. And I talked to Brzezinski about it. I was over in his office in D.C., and he says, "You should write that story because that's a real story." And I said, "Okay, but I got to finish your story first." And he goes, "Okay, well."
What year are we talking here? Because it sounds like the seed was planted some time ago.
Yeah, 20 years ago. And then I started a YouTube channel maybe 6 or 7 years ago called The H Frame, and I suggested this to my, kind of like you guys, what you guys are doing. And he says, "That's an interesting story, but nobody in Poland cares about that guy or knows who he is." And I said, "Well, that's part of the problem. That's why I want to do the just a 10-minute film on this guy. Let's just try to do it. And why don't we try to contact his family?" And he says, that's, and he kind of did. And we let this. He kind of quit, and then I said, "Well, I really want to do this story." So I got my friend, who's a boxing referee in Poland, a quite prominent one. I used to go to fights with him quite often here. And he got me the private number to Pietrzykowski's widow, who was a fantastic woman, Halina. And she says, "Well, come down to Bielska-Biała, and we'll listen to you. If you want to do it, we can cooperate." And I went down there one weekend on a Saturday, and they turned out to be the most wonderful people I've ever met. The family was great. The grandson was great. I probably was down there for 10 weekends in April of 2019, I guess, before the virus, and that kind of interrupted things. But it was a great experience. So
curious about one thing, though. Obviously, you have a background as an academic. You write a lot. You research a lot. You did the book about Brzezinski. When your attention turned to Pietrzykowski, the boxer, why weren't you thinking book instead of film? I mean, in other words, why did you go down the path of making a film instead?
That's a good question, and it's a fair question. For one, with the Brzezinski book, he gave me personal access to all of his archives, so I had so much stuff to go through. I had literally, at his D.C. office, he had files and like broom closets full of archives I could go through. With boxing, there's at least in me, and I don't, I'm not. The Polish language was obviously a barrier, but also there was not. Brzezinski advised every president from Kennedy to Obama until, and there's so much.
There's something to work with there.
Yeah, there's a story there. And he was, he's the guy that everybody thinks runs the world with. In the movie Convoy, if you ever watch it, that Sam Peckinpah movie with Ollie McGraw and Chris Christopherson, they're going across the country in a trucker strike, and they ask the guy, why are you guys doing this? And he says, "Because that goddamn Trilateral Commission." So Brzezinski.
Best reference ever, Patrick.
Yeah, and I think Elvis Presley there's a Talking Heads movie where Elvis Presley thought in his latter days at Memphis and Graceland, he thought the Trilateral Commission ran the world. So Brzezinski had he had a bigger story. Pietrzykowski was just a boxer who was a humble guy from a pretty small town, Bielska-Biała, who was a solid guy. And the only way I could really tell this story, I thought, was like visual and telling the story. I don't think I could get a 300-page book out of it. But when I started this story, there was a great guy, my friend Leszek, whose father was the bronze medalist in the Montreal Olympics, Pławczyński. He was writing a book on that, and I didn't want to interfere with that. So I just said, let's cooperate and we'll work together. And he said, great. And that book came out last year. It's called Fist of Angels, or Angel Fist. And I recommend this book if you're a Polish speaker to go get this book. It's a fantastic book about Pietrzykowski. So I didn't want to, I didn't want to interfere with that. That I know what it takes to write a book, and it's really hard. And I didn't want to be in any way interfering with his project.
Once was enough. Huh?
Yeah, once was enough.
Before we get deeper into the story of Pietrzykowski and his accomplishments, let's take another step backwards here because, as I mentioned earlier, he was in the Olympics 3 times, 56, 60, and 64. And, of course, 60 was the big fight with Cassius Clay, later Muhammad Ali. But people today might not have a feeling for just how big of a stage this was at that time. And the Olympics have always been politicized to some degree, but 56 especially, 60, 64, this is kind of like peak politicization.
They were very political.
Politicization.
Thank you very much.
There you go. Okay.
So kind of give us a backdrop of what those Olympics were like, sporting wise, exactly.
The 1956 Olympics. Well, first of all, I'll just tell his backstory a little bit, and then we'll get there. Mm-hmm. He's from Bielska-Biała, born in 1934. So obviously, he was a kid when the war came out, and I always thought that if you're born in 1934 and you come out of the war, you've seen almost everything imaginable you can imagine. So boxing and sports is a luxury after that. He spent the war, fearing for his life, and like most kids, and he was like, just worried if he was going to see the next day. So after the war, he was a good athlete and he started to play volleyball, but then sports in Poland and communist societies in general was so political. You can watch, there's a great documentary on the Soviet hockey team about how this was more than just hockey.
Big Red Machine.
Yeah. And so he started to box. His older brother, Victor, sort of was a good boxer. And he says, I want to learn how to box. And he ended up being good. He was a left-handed guy, really strong. There's a legendary Polish boxing coach, Felix Stam, who was Papa Stam, and it was like a legendary Polish boxing coach. And he taught this very specific style how to fight. It was a defensive way to fight. And Pietrzykowski, was a great Polish fighter. I think he's probably the best Polish fighter of all time, but he never, he never won a gold medal. Because he had these guys in front of him, a Hungarian named Laszlo Papp, who won 3 gold medals in 48, 52, and 56. And then he fought Cassius Clay in 1960. So there's a great story there. This guy is such a great fighter, but he could never get to the top because he had these guys that were so good in front of him. And what I really like about Ziggy or Pietrzykowski is he lost to these guys. My voice is gone. I
joined the club.
I can't believe it. But he lost to these guys, Pop, in 56, but he's the only guy ever to knock out Laszlo Pop. The only guy ever. And he knocked him out in 1956. And then it was political because it was September of 56, I think, when he knocked him out. And in between that, the Soviets invaded Hungary. And then there was the Melbourne Olympics, and then Pop beat Pietrzykowski. So they had this great trilogy, kind of like the what we're talking about, the Fraser Ali trilogy. There was a great Laszlo Pop Pietrzykowski trilogy that most people don't know about, but he's the only guy ever to knock out Laszlo Pop, and that's something. Laszlo Pop, they said, was the only guy that could compare with him was Sugar Ray Robinson, because the Hungarian communist government would never let him box professionally. They did, but in a very limited way. And Pietrzykowski knocked him out in the second round, and you don't see that very often in an amateur fight. And he was a great Polish boxer, and he's just in above that, he's just a great human story. His family's great. He's a modest guy, and so that's why I wanted to do the project.
People may forget that actually Poland has a pretty impressive history at the Olympics in boxing. They're 6th all time in terms of total medals. 6th with 43 medals. A little bit of a dry spell. I think the last one was 92, I think, so it's been a while. But, after the war, they were right up there with America, Soviet Union, Cuba.
John, if you look at those teams that Felix Stam was the coach, this like 48, 52, 56, 60, and 64, they have, they were winning gold medals. Like I said, Pietrzykowski never won a gold medal, but the other guys did. I mean, they were the best team, period. And their big rival, of course, was a political rival, and that was the Soviet Union. And some of those fights were really dramatic because they had larger meaning, obviously, with the politics after 56.
As you said, he was a little bit unlucky with his timing. Kind of reminds me of something you see in other individual sports like golf or tennis. There are people who are amazing, but if they peak at the wrong time, and as you say, there's a guy or two ahead of them, they don't become a legend simply because of when they entered the sport, right?
Yeah, well, you could say the NBA, like how many titles Karl Malone never won because Michael Jordan was around.
Somebody's a little bit better team, and in the way I think of. I'm reminded of 80s, 90s tennis stars. Your Jim Courier maybe would have won everything had others. Pete Sampras, for example, Andre Agassi not been there.
No, but it's a really good example.
Well, there's the other one, of course, contemporary with Lewandowski in football, who's kind of constantly in the shadow of Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi.
Same idea.
Really good example of that, because and Clay outshone everybody. When Clay was not just a boxer, he was a world famous celebrity. He was really the first sports celebrity of the modern television era. And Pietrzykowski is a guy that works on his car down in Bielska-Biała and owns a cafe. And he doesn't want this celebrity, but he gets it anyway, at least down in Bielska-Biała. But that's not the world stage.
Just curious to know if you know anything about this, Patrick. If you don't, it's okay, but I couldn't find anything. We're talking about Pietrzykowski's bad timing. 56, he loses to Pap, who's just a legend. 60, he runs into Cassius Clay and more bad luck. In 64, as I remember, he went out in the semifinals against a Soviet boxer whose name I don't remember. You know anything about that fight, about why maybe 64 he came short again? Any idea?
Well, he was getting older. There's a great photo, and I will show it if you guys have it on here. He fought in the European Championships against a Soviet fighter, and it was a bloodbath. And I talked to his widow about this, Halina, and she's, bless her heart, she's the nicest woman I've ever met. And we had a lot of long conversations around her kitchen table down on Bielska-Biała. And there's this great fight. There's this great photo of her, and he's got blood. It looks like Adrian and Rocky, and it's in 1963. And she says she was worried about his life. He was and he won that fight. Think about that. And she's got like a fur coat, and she told me it's a fake fur coat. It's not real. And he's got blood dripping off his face. And that was 1963. And I think 64, he was kind of fading. And then that was it. These guys, we were talking in the kitchen earlier, these guys have 300 amateur fights. That's like gladiator stuff, And so 64, I think he got the silver or the bronze. I should know this, but 64 in Tokyo.
Oh, bronze.
64. He got the bronze. 64, I think he was pretty much done. He was 32 years old, and that was kind of it.
Among the materials that you shared with us, just so we can get a background on this, was some footage from the fight with Ali, well, I should say Cassius Clay in 1960. And history records it as a 5-0 points win for Ali. It looks pretty one-sided. But in fact, the fight was not so one-sided. And there are a couple of times when Pietrzykowski, he's left-handed. He lands this left 2 or 3 times, like smack on Ali's face. Definitely got his attention. So history's a little bit harsh to Pietrzykowski in the sense of it looks like he got completely dominated when in fact he really didn't.
That's a very close fight, and I think that is one reason why. And I think this is the backstory that's really important: is that Clay and later Ali really respected Pietrzykowski for the rest of his life, and until they both died around the same time, and they were friends until both of them died. And you could see in the film I sent you, the trailer of the film, that in This Is Your Life, Ali was kind of bored. Everyone saying, "Oh, here's Jimmy Ellis," or "Here's your kid."
Sorry, this is the UK version of This Is Your Life.
It's a UK version.
So just for anyone listening who doesn't know, there used to be this interesting show. They get a celebrity on, and they would bring people from that person's past to be reunited with them. And Muhammad Ali was the guest. And they brought back, what year was this? 70?
It looked like after the Spinks fight, the first Spinks fight. So I'm guessing
78.
77. So Ali's still active, but he's kind of, it looks like he's retired.
So like Patrick says, they bring back different people, and okay, he's indifferent. But when they announce that they've brought back Pietrzykowski, there's like legitimate surprise and delight in Muhammad Ali's eyes.
And it's really, you can see this, and it's on YouTube, so you can see it. I mean, they bring back all these elementary school teachers. There's Jimmy Ellis, and there's, I think, even Tom Jones, which is weird, you know. And
Great combination.
Tom Jones from Las Vegas. Hi, Muhammad.
It's not unusual.
You know, yeah, exactly. And Ali says, "Hey, there's Tom Jones," and he's kind of going, "Okay, this is weird," you know. And the whole point of the game show, we're talking to a younger generation. It's like he's supposed to be surprised by all these people, right. You know. But when the guy says, and from Krakow, I think he says Krakow by mistake. He says from Poland, and all these eyes get really big, and he goes, "He's here."
Yeah, he knows who it is immediately,
and he jumps off the chair, and he actually, you could see he literally jumps off the chair, and even though they have a language barrier, there's something about two gladiators that fought 20 years earlier that stayed with them. Ali knew he was in a fight. And that fight was 3 rounds, and it might be 5-0 by the judges, but Clay knew he was in a fight. And he gave him trouble because he's left-handed. But Pietrzykowski is a great fighter. You don't beat Laszlo Pop, you know, like Clay knew that he was in a fight. And I think Clay respected him for the rest of his life, because if you're ever in a fight with somebody and you're the greatest, that's what Ali was called, you know that somebody gave you a fight. You that stays with you.
Yeah, there's trash talking. Of course, he was the king of trash talk, but there's boxers also, there's some respect as well.
Yeah, and I think he had that with Frazier a little bit, but I don't think Frazier ever forgave Ali for the trash talk, and I don't think Ali wanted to trash talk with Pietrzykowski. I think he knew Pietrzykowski was a serious man. He probably knew that he beat Laszlo Pop. You know, our radio listeners don't know who Laszlo Pop is, but Cassius Clay in 1960 knew who Laszlo Pop was because he won the gold medal in 48, 52, and 56. And if some guy beat Laszlo Pop, Cassius Clay knew who that person was. And I think that's why he respected him so much. And there's a great little article in the New York Times when Cassius Clay beat Sonny Liston for the first time. And they misspell his name, of course. But in the New York Times, it says Polish, foe of Clay in 1960 sends his congratulations, and they had a personal connection. It's really nice. And I can tell you a funny anecdotal story, but go ahead, and I see you have another question.
Well, I was also going to mention that in this material that you sent us, again, just to get a feel for the story and the kind of the kind of boxer he was and everything else. One of the people you interviewed for the film made the comment, something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing here, but had Pietrzykowski been born in America, for example, with the exact same talent, he would have become a megastar, right? But the fact that he was behind the Iron Curtain, kind of cut off from the world of big-time pro boxing, meant that his life was going to go in a different direction.
I think that's very true, and I think that's true with Laszlo Pop, because Laszlo Pop said the only guy that I wanted to fight was Sugar Ray Robinson, but we never could do it because of politics, And I think the modern equivalent you could see is when the European players started to play in the NBA, and the same with ice hockey players in the NHL. You could see these guys were the world class players, but they never got a chance to play. And the communist governments in Poland and Hungary would never let Pietrzykowski or Laszlo Pop fight professionally. I mean, it was just not done. So they had to stay in a very comfortable life. Obviously, they were sports stars, and in the communist system, they were treated very well. But they could never make the big money, and they could never become, say, Macho Camacho, or Thomas Hearns or Sugar Ray Leonard. They never got a chance to show what they could do on a world stage. They were very limited. They fought in the European Championships, but they never got a chance to be Muhammad Ali, for example, or Cassius Clay.
So his talent's undeniable. The record speaks for itself. On top of that, you've got this incredible circumstance where the simple guy from Bielsko-Biała is in the ring with the guy who later becomes arguably the biggest sports icon ever
of the 20th century, for sure.
20th century for sure, probably ever. I would argue
forever.
And yet, when you search Zbigniew Pietrzykowski on Google here in Poland, you don't get as much coverage from Polish media and Polish sources as you would expect. I find that very, very strange.
I think there's a couple things for that. And compare it to Małysz and the ski jumping or something, 15, 20 years ago. For one, I think he was a modest guy, and he ran a cafe. I've been to that cafe down in Bielsko-Biała. It's just a normal little place.
So it's still there.
Yep, it's still. Well, it's not but the building is still there. It's right next to a place that they're making margarine. It's a margarine factory.
Well, why not? Somebody has to.
I know, but his grandson, who's a great guy, Piotr. Hello, we'll talk soon. But he says, yeah, this is where my grandfather was just happy to come back from the Olympics, and he wasn't a star like Cassius Clay or Muhammad Ali. He just came back and ran a cafe, and that's how sports was in the early '60s in Poland. That's how it was. He was a celebrity for sure, but he wasn't an icon like Cassius Clay became because he didn't have the stage. He didn't have the microphone.
Working on this film, and again, it's a work in progress, working on this film has surely brought you into contact with people who are active today in the Polish boxing scene, very knowledgeable about the Polish boxing scene.
Yeah.
What's your sense for the kind of how legendary is Pietrzykowski today on the Polish boxing scene? How much does his name ring out?
It's funny. Like, nobody even knew what I was talking about, and that's true with Brzezinski as well. By the way,
Good to see even you have problems pronouncing the name.
Brzezinski. Yeah. Well, there's two. In America, he was Brzezinski because it was just
it's complicated.
It's hard, but Pietrzykowski. I think most young people don't care about things that happened 2 weeks ago, much less 1960. And they
Facebook generation, huh?
Well, I know I can listen. I don't want to say that.
I said it. My words.
Okay, but
my words.
but when you talk about a guy like Laszlo Papp, who was a 3-time gold medalist in Olympic boxing, and he's just completely forgotten, except for like fight fans or people in Hungary might know who he is. But and I think Pietrzykowski didn't blow his own horn. He was a very modest guy. He liked working on his car down in Bielsko-Biała. He worked for like a meat inspecting. That was his job. And at Christmas, he would bring meat to people in the 70s when there wasn't a lot of meat in Poland around the holidays. And he was that kind of guy. And Clay was on top of the world, literally almost. I mean, on top of the world, not literally, but he was on top of the sports world. And Pietrzykowski was just kind of a modest guy who went back to his small town in Poland and was content with that.
Oh, wait, did he have, later in his life, did he have no connection to boxing, training?
Oh, he was a coach for the Polish boxing team in the 70s, and he was a good coach. As far as I have heard, he was a good coach. But he was also... He was a family man. He said the best thing, he said, I fought Cassius Clay, but the best thing in my life was my wife and my 2 daughters. And that's what I really valued. And he wasn't a big celebrity. I think if he wanted to, that just wasn't his personality. And he died maybe 10 years ago, and they had a big funeral in Bielsko-Biała.
2014, I think it was.
2014, and the whole town came, But he's not a global celebrity. That just wasn't his style, and I like that about this story.
I've forgotten the name. You mentioned it earlier, Patrick, the legendary coach of the Polish boxing team?
Felix Stam.
Okay. Yeah. So based on what your own impressions, was Pietrzykowski a product of a system, or was he an exceptional talent who was going to be successful no matter what? Or what do you think about that?
I think it's both of those. Anybody who's ever had a good coach and you've played sports, you know how much coaching matters. But he was also a natural. Felix Stam used to say that he fought like a barracuda. He was like he was a left-handed guy with
like a barracuda.
He had this great jab, and you have to have some sort of natural talent. We were talking about this before when I told you about Jerry Quarry as being the original Rocky. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could even say Pietrzykowski was the original Rocky. But the original Rocky Balboa in the film in 1976, he was a club fighter. He was like, he'd lost 10 club fights in a row, and they took his locker. That's not a realistic story that he's going to come around and now be the world heavyweight championship for 10 years after that.
It makes for a good movie, though.
I know, it makes for a good movie. But Pietrzykowski, that could fit. And Jerry Quarry, that was possible because those guys were real good fighters. They were world-class fighters. But I think that you can make the case that Pietrzykowski and Clay was kind of like the Apollo Creed Balboa relationship in a way, and I'm stretching that a little bit, but
not much, but yeah, I see it. Yeah.
Pietrzykowski had his widow Helena was fantastic. She told me the story that they got dogs. They had two Doberman pinschers, and they were named after Ali, and they said that Ali stayed with them their whole lives, because of the mutual respect that they had, and Ali was honored by that. He told him that, and so they had a mutual respect. Only fighters that fight each other know what that means to be in a good fight, and you respect the other guy, and there was any trash talk between those two. It was just mutual respect, and I think that says a lot.
Before I forget, I want to remind anybody listening to, go to YouTube, like Patrick says, look up "This Is Your Life, Muhammad Ali." Yeah, I guess that's enough.
Like that, yeah.
And you can tell it's a production from the late 70s. And the host, who's probably a famous person that Josh would know,
is it Eamon Andrews, isn't it?
BBC? Is that what it is? Or yeah.
Actually, I haven't seen that particular episode, but traditionally it was Eamon Andrews. I think it wasn't always on the BBC. I think it was ITV, and then or maybe the other way around. But
it was. It has that late 70s cheese to it.
Definitely,
but
very wide collars. Yes.
Yeah, but the moral of the story, I think you're trying to say, is that Ali was kind of bored with the whole thing because it's a surprise. He didn't know, the whole idea is that it's a surprise. Oh, this is your life. We're going to call all these people from your,
But he's definitely not acting when they mention Pietrzykowski. Definitely, it's genuine. It's genuine.
And Ali, if you look at all of his opponents, Liston, Frazier, Foreman, Norton, he never really respected him like he did in this. You can see it in this 30 seconds. He's on when they say from Krakow, all the way from Poland, and Ali's eyes get big, and he goes, "He's here. You brought him here? No way!"
Nice.
So you see, there's a respect there, and I think that's important for this story.
And the film is we probably should have mentioned this half an hour ago. It's called Ziggy, by the way, which is a convenient shortcut for Zbigniew for a lot of non-Polish speakers.
And I will tell you the story. I just didn't know. I'm not a filmmaker. I'm a person. I write books. I'm an academic, and I can tell good stories once in a while, but I wanted to tell this story just in a short YouTube film, but then somebody says, you got to make this into a bigger film. And I said, I don't know how to do that. I'm not a film person. And so I made a trailer just to show why this should be a film. And I did it probably 2 weeks before the big lockdown.
Haven't you seen those iPhone commercials? Everybody's a filmmaker these days. Come on, everybody can do it. It's easy, apparently.
Well, and I was a little bit embarrassed because I was over my head where I said, we just got a camera, right? We just tell the story. And people look at me like, oh.
Oh, Patrick. Oh, Patrick.
It was so easy. Yeah. And I said, okay, well, let's just try it. And they said, ha, ha, ha. So I tried it. I made a 2-minute trailer. I did it with no budget. I did it with a guy in a couple of guys with about 15 beers one Saturday, and we just put it all together, and that's the trailer. I'm not in the trailer, but I will narrate this film.
But the idea is to go and push forward and make this happen.
Make it happen, because I said, here's a good story here, let's make it happen. And people said, nobody cares about this story. And I said, that's why you have to make the film, to make people care. And that's why I wanted to do this film. And if the film never gets made, I don't care. I met the family is fantastic. The story, even in a 1-minute trailer, that's enough. I'm glad I did it.
Oh, it's definitely. The trailer is definitely enough to spark anyone's interest in this story. If you're familiar with these Polish sports, boxing generally, I think you and I were talking before we started recording. We said that boxing fans are probably a little more serious about the history of their sport than maybe fans of other sports. And this is a great story.
Yeah, and John, that's why boxing makes such great drama.
Yeah.
Rocky, or Somebody Up There Likes Me, or there's so many. The whole, Scorsese, the Raging Bull story.
Nobody gets excited about tennis movies.
Yeah, it's hard to make. Yeah, here's a drama about Bjorn Borg.
Nobody cares.
But you can do Jake LaMotta,
Absolutely, all day long, day long,
because it's a combat sport.
I've got maybe another question or two, but before I'm kind of keeping Dr. Mike and Josh. Guys, any questions for Patrick before I continue?
Yeah.
Okay, that's awkward.
No, I was going to ask more about the direction that you want to present the film, as in, like, it's a documentary, but it's going to be interviews here? Are you going to go to places and film things? What's the actual structure that you're trying to aim for?
That's a fair question, because it was a subject of debate with my original producer, and
There's a vision for the film.
He's a good guy, but we had a different view on the film, and I just said, I just want to make it a story about a boxer, but also a person and a man and a good person. And he kind of wanted to go the direction of, let's make it a reality type of modern type of film. And I said, I can't do that. Really, I just want to show you why this guy matters, why Polish boxing matters, why people like Laszlo Pop matter, Felix Stam. All of these side characters are almost as important as Pietrzykowski himself and his family. The guy raised 2 great daughters. He has a great wife. She's still around, Helena, down in Bielsko-Biała. And it's just a good story. And I'm so tired of all these Kardashian stories. And I just want to make something that's an anti-Kardashian story. And this is the closest thing I could think of. So that's why I wanted to do it. And it wasn't easy doing it, to get all these people together. And Leszek, the boxing referee, thank you for the original contact. And I tried to do it. And I tried to do it in a tasteful way. But in this day and age, it's not that easy to do that. And people are saying this is boring. Nobody cares about a boxer who's, and I said, well, maybe, but let's try to make them care.
I will support anything that bills itself as the anti-Kardashian story. I think we all do.
Yeah.
We're all on board with that.
Yeah. And he just seemed like a good guy. I interviewed a guy from Bielsko-Biała who just said, Pietrzykowski was a guy growing up in Bielsko-Biała. He was everybody's hero, but nobody knew who he was in the wider world, but he was a local hero. He was a guy that he ran a cafe called the Pavilion. It's still there. It was just a normal cafe. And he came back from the Olympics, and Ali comes back from the Olympics and he's a celebrity, and he's on the Dick Cavett show. He's fighting Liston. He's meeting the Beatles. Pietrzykowski comes back to Bielsko-Biała and he's running a coffee shop, near a margarine factory, but he's happy with that. He's happy with his small town life, and I think there's a parable there, and I think that's the story I wanted to tell. And it's not easy to tell that story because nobody wants to hear about the story about the guy that runs a cafe near a margarine factory. They want to see Ali throwing the gold medal off the bridge into the river, and all of the
drama.
Yeah. There's a great story about this, and I'll end here. Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, was a great showman, and he was not a stupid person at all. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was like Little Richard. I think he took Little Richard's act a little bit, and there's a story where he met Gorgeous George, who was a wrestler back in the late 50s and early 60s, and Gorgeous George was this guy that was the villain.
The heel.
And everybody hated Gorgeous George. And Gorgeous George met Ali at a talk show somewhere. And Gorgeous George says, hey, man, the way to sell tickets is not to be boring. You got to make people want to see you get beat, and you got to not get beat. That's how you get to be Gorgeous George, And Cassius Clay is like 21 years old. He says, hey, man. And he was smart enough to realize that. And he became Cassius Clay. He became the greatest. I am the greatest. I am the greatest. And he was the best showman in American sports history. Pietrzykowski went back to Bielsko-Biała and he ran a cafe. And those are 2 parallel stories that I think are really important. And I just wanted to tell that story. These guys were really close, but they were completely different personalities, but it doesn't mean they didn't respect each other. And that's a hard story to tell, and maybe I can't tell it in a film, but I'm going to try.
Well, I think I'll save my questions for next time, Patrick, because I don't think we can improve on that as an ending, bringing the subject to a close. Yeah. Ziggy is the name of the film. Again, a work in progress. We definitely will be the first to watch it when it's ready, so please let us know. And we'll make you promise to come back here sometime and answer some other questions about life, the universe, and everything, and sports and Polish stuff and this and that. Thanks very much for joining us.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, John. Thank you for having me.
And thanks everybody for listening. KrakCast.pl, of course, is the site. You can check out all of our back episodes, and we'll catch everybody next time on the KrakCast.